You can turn that thing off if you want. Yeah. So I know a lot of the faces here, and so I want to make sure I don't bore anybody. I don't have a particular program or slides or speech that I intended to do. I really wanted to just talk and answer questions and share our experience. As Doug said, or as Charlie said, thank you, Charlie, for the kind opening. Really, my wife is the hero. I'm just the loudmouth, so she's the one who does all the hard work. But yeah, this is our property. And for those of you who, if there's any of you who don't know it, this was a property we planned on building a sort of ecotourism experience on. We are sitting in the place that would be very close to a nice sort of found and foraged tasting menu style restaurant and a series of cabins kind of nested at the edges of the property, really concentrated on celebrating how beautiful it is to be here and to live here. And then on the part of the property closer to 151, we'd have some more sort of market-driven kinds of things that would be not as much for people who were spending the night, but for folks who were just sort of day trippers coming through. And when the proposed pipeline path crosses Spruce Creek, almost where you drove across, if you saw the creek there, just a few feet up to your left. But all of the trees there at that creek crossing would be gone for, let's call it 50 feet to the right of the creek as you came across it, and another 100 feet to the left, plus some staging areas. And then the path of the pipeline runs just on the bottom side of that little pond there, straight through the center of the property, really bisecting the 100 acres. And as Charlie said, then just by happenstance, it finds its way across 151 and across the Rockfish River, and then onto our family homestead on the other side of the property, where it goes within about 100 feet of my sister's house and about 300 feet of mine. I could throw a baseball from my front door to where the path of the pipeline is. And so for all of the obvious reasons, we've been hell-bent to stop the pipeline since the beginning. I will tell you that has been that's been a huge learning experience for us across the board. And we came into this very much fighting to protect our own property and our family homestead and the things we care about, and really more from a property rights or landowner rights perspective. And along the way, our ideas about land ownership, about property rights, our understanding of fracking and natural gas, and the way DEQ works, and our water quality. There's been this massive learning experience that has shifted our perspective, that we have a much more holistic view now. That is, while stopping the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is really important for us individually and for us as a community, or a broader community and state, it is just the beginning, because this pipeline is purely a symptom of a much, much bigger systemic problem in the way in which we're managing our energy infrastructure and treating property and citizen landowner rights, treating really the poorest in our communities and the most disenfranchised that pipelines routinely target. So it's become a very eye-opening last 4 years that has made us decide that for us, beating the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is step one in what is now going to be work we've got to do for a long time. We need to fix it so this doesn't happen to anyone anymore, anywhere. So with that opening, I mean, there are probably as many people here who know as much or more about eminent domain as I do. But I'm happy to talk about eminent domain, what I've learned about it, talk about quick take, which is a little lesser known, and the combination of the way these pipelines use conditional permits with eminent domain plus quick take to completely take away a citizen's right to due process. I mean, what really happens in the end is the companies will talk about how they negotiate, talk about how they're working with landowners, and at this stage on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, I think we're beyond 95% of the easements signed, or probably more. And in the beginning, I was angry when people I knew signed easements. And at this stage, I have great compassion for those folks, because what you realize is the system is so hard rigged against you that sorry, Chris, I'll stop moving around so much.
You're good.
The system is so hard rigged against you that at the time at which you're sued and they begin the process, there are lots of really sound reasons to negotiate and settle, because you have very little power beyond that to influence what could happen on your property. And I say all the time now, my greatest, I believe we're going to beat this pipeline. I think there is a huge, significant chance that we will win this, which I've always had to believe, but I will say I feel different in my gut now than I did even a few months ago. With a couple of fundamental permits, the great work of SELC and Sierra Club and AppleMad and all the landowners who have created the space for those lawyers to do remarkable work is pretty incredible. So I believe we'll win. But what I'm now most afraid of is what I call the win-lose condition, which is we'll win, but by the time we win, they will have done such extraordinary, irreparable damage to our communities and our property and our land that we love and cherish so much that our lives are changed in ways we can't quite conceive of right now. And that's the scary part. And it is this combination of eminent domain, conditional permits, and quick take that make that possible. Most of you, have you guys heard of the Hallorans, the sugar maple tree farm up in Pennsylvania? Is anybody here not? I'll tell that story real quick just in case. So, and I could get some of the facts wrong, but big picture, that was the Atlantic Sunrise Pipeline. It was going through Pennsylvania out to New York State. That when FERC gives an environmental impact statement or approves a pipeline, in the moment that they give that approval, they're giving this, they have adopted a practice which is not part of law, it's just a practice they have, which is giving the pipeline approval to proceed even with conditional permits. And it basically says, we've in concept approved this project, but there are probably dozens or even sometimes hundreds of permits that have to be gotten along the way, which we assume you will get, and when you get them, you'll be able to proceed. If you don't get them, you can't proceed. But in the meantime, they allow pipeline companies to begin cutting trees, disturbing land, doing all kinds of things in places where they have whatever permits are required for that stretch, right? And so in the Hallorans case, and with that comes the right to eminent domain. So the right to begin seizing property. And so in the Hallorans case on the Atlantic Sunrise, they got their permits, they began a process of eminent domain. The Hallorans didn't want to settle, so that case is going to go to court, but it won't go to court for several years. So our eminent domain case, by the way, for this property is set for January 2021. But they'll probably start cutting trees in September in Nelson County. That's what they'd like to do, right? And that's only because we've held them off a year and a half. They would have cut, they cut up by wintergreen almost 2 years ago now. So in any regard, in the Hallorans case, it was much like that. They got the permits, they began eminent domain. They couldn't settle with the Hallorans, so they imposed quick take. Does everybody know what quick take means? No. Okay, so quick take also is a thing that does not exist in the Natural Gas Act or in eminent domain law. It is an affect of a ruling called Sage versus East Tennessee in 2004, I think? I'm trying to remember now. I think it's 2004. In any regard, it was a pipeline that like this that got the right to proceed and the right to use eminent domain. And they had some landowners that wouldn't settle, and the courts are backed up, so those eminent domain cases were scheduled way out like mine. And the pipeline went to the courts and said, look, like you can't have us held up for 2 or 3 years waiting to deal with this eminent domain case. We know that we're going to get the rights to it. We have that right from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So why don't you just give us the right to take the land now for immediate possession, what has become called quick take, and we'll settle the details later. And the court said, yeah, that seems about right, and gave them that right. And ever since, every other court has followed suit, with one exception. There was a challenge in the 7th Circuit where they didn't give that right. But by and large, every court in hundreds and hundreds of cases has said, they cite Sage as precedent that established law. But the eminent domain law says that you can only take land from a property owner once you've given just compensation. And if just compensation can't be negotiated between the two of you, the taker and the property owner, then you go to court. And in court, a citizen should have the right, or an entity, any company, should have the right to argue a number of things. First, that the taking happens at all. You should have a right to make a case saying, this isn't necessary, you don't have to do it this way, and I object to the taking. You should have the right to then to object to all of the particulars of the taking. Hey, you don't need as much space. You don't need an access road also. You don't need to put it right here through the middle of my property, move it to the edge. You should be able to argue all of those elements, right? And lastly, you should be able to argue what is fair and just compensation. But what happens with quick take is they give them the rights. Whatever rights were on their original maps that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approved, and the only thing left when you go to court is price, at a time when the damage is already done, right? Because if they get quick take, you've got no negotiating power. You can't move you can't make them do anything that they don't want to do, because they have this absolute right to take your land. And so they gave that right of quick take to the company with the Hallerans. The Hallerans had a 100-year-old maple sugar farm with these fabulous maple trees, and it was in harvest, or just coming up on harvesting season. And they first pleaded in every way they could to move the path of the pipeline to the edges or around and not go through the middle and really gut their orchard. And they couldn't win that. The pipeline company said, no, we got the right, this is the most convenient path. Court gave us the right, we're going right through here. And then they begged and pleaded, don't cut them now, at least let us get through this harvest season. The pipeline said, no, we don't have time for that, cut all the trees down. The state of New York denied the water permit. The Atlantic Sunrise Pipeline was stopped. It won't be built. But the Hallerans' maple sugar farm is gone, right? So think about that. That's what I describe as this win-lose condition. So they stopped the pipeline, but they've already lost everything that they cared about, everything that was dear to them, right? And so that combination of eminent domain plus conditional permits plus quick take sets you up in an absolutely impossible situation. And so people think that landowners will only go negotiate about money, and some do, and that's all some care about, and that's also okay. But also there's all of those other things. Can you move it to the right? Can you move it to the left? Can you take a little less land? Can you not cut those trees? You know, can we negotiate that you won't put an access road through here, or a containment pond, or whatever, right? So on our family's property on the other side, there are two things that they want to do. One is they want to cut the pipeline path right next to my sister's house, then right behind my house, up and over our high ridge. That is a horrific thing to think about. The property that we have trails on, that we walk on, that I hunt on, that we collect mushrooms on, that's been a big part of our life, that our kids catch salamanders in the creeks, it would all be significantly damaged or destroyed from that. But add to that, they wanted to put an access road in one of my sister's front fields. And that access road would mean that we have this little 12-foot wide meandering driveway that we specifically built that way for sort of the beauty of it, right? It sort of follows the contour of the land. It's part of that experience as you're coming in. And it snakes, a mile through our property as it gets to each of our family's houses. Because we bought this property together with my sister-in-law, and my parents. We split it up into parcels. That was in 2003, and we all built our homes there, and we've raised our kids next to each other. So kind of, old school homestead. And so this road, it affects all of us. And in order to make it an access road, they would have to come in and widen that to 30 feet wide with ditches on both sides, significantly straighten it, because they would expect to take these massive trucks in and out of there. And that is almost more damaging than the pipeline path, except of course for the threat of the bomb part of the pipeline. We'll address that separately. But the experience of living there would be, if even after we would beat the pipeline, the experience of what it means to live on that piece of land would be changed in a way that is just not fixable. no matter what. And of course they say, oh, you will never even notice it once we're gone, right? We'll put it all back. I mean, we know how well that works. So that's a sort of high level view. And this thing about quick take, the Institutes for Justice have petitioned to the Supreme Court in the Third Circuit on an issue of quick take right now. There is a petition coming up in either the 6th or the 7th Circuit on another series of quick take claims, and our council is trying to raise some money right now because they're gonna do it. They think they can do it for about half their normal rates, and it's still going to cost about $25,000. And so we're going to try to raise enough money that they can take it up also in the 4th Circuit, with the idea that if we have 3 cert petitions to the Supreme Court, all on the same issue, we have a much higher chance that they'll actually decide it's time to do something about this, right? Because we've been 14 years affected by the Sage case, and it's really time to overturn it. So that's sort of a high-level overview. Well, questions?
Well, I think he should mention that eminent domain and just compensation is part of the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's what amendment? Third?
Oh, I've forgotten now. The 9th?
Lawyers in the audience.
I can't believe I've forgotten, but I've forgotten. But you're right.
Yeah.
It's a constitutional issue. I'm probably as much libertarian as anything, except for some of the crazy parts of the libertarian platform. But I firmly believe that the question of eminent domain is nowhere near as complicated as people make it out to be. I think it's a fairly simple thing that we should share a position on, which is, look, if you're going to take an individual or an entity's land for a purpose that meets a public need, it's a very significant taking. It should be done very judiciously and only when it's absolutely necessary. But second from that, there should be a bright red line of what to decide. The first hurdle should be, will the value of the asset, the land, the business, whatever it is you're taking, be transferred into the public trust, meaning the federal government, a state government, a county government, a city government? And if that's the case, then we should then go on to the next questions. Is it necessary? How else could it be avoided? How do we take care of the landowner? All of the other parts. If the answer is no, we should be done. Like, that should be the end of the question, right? I mean, right now what we have is a case where the courts are using eminent domain, or they're giving a private entity the right to seize land from a private individual or corporation for their gain. So in our case, in this piece of property, this is in a little LLC that my dad and I established. It's a corporate entity. And one corporate entity is seizing the land of another corporate entity in order for its shareholder profits. The idea that that's allowed is so fundamentally unfathomable. So, yes?
Is Sage in New York State?
I'm sorry?
What state is Sage in?
Sage is Tennessee.
Tennessee?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it was Sage versus East Tennessee.
I see.
Yeah, and I've forgotten the name of the pipeline project.
The question is, what is the difference between quick take and eminent domain?
So eminent domain is the law that allows, under certain circumstances, the government to seize your land supposedly for the public necessity.
But what about private companies doing it?
Well, so this is the crazy thing. The Natural Gas Act, and this is one of the things that we are trying to argue at the federal court level and the Supreme Court. The Natural Gas Act declares that public utilities have the right of eminent domain in order to facilitate distribution of power and energy and utility. So the idea was, we need to get power lines to rural communities. We need to get water and sewer to places that haven't had it. We might need to run little natural gas lines. And I really should let Tom Hadwin speak more to this than me, because he's much more expert on this. But that's conceptually, that's why utilities got this idea of, or this opportunity to claim eminent domain in order to facilitate, community and civic development. What's happened over time, though, is at the time at which that was written, our whole public utility ecosystem was very different than it is today. We now have these massive monopolies like Dominion, who more or less control the ecosystem from start to finish in a community. So you have captive ratepayers who have no utility highways from one destination to another, so they can feed captive ratepayer markets, and they can charge those ratepayers for building the project and whatever rate they want, because they're the only one who services the communities. And so the whole ecosystem Tom presented recently, I believe the numbers are that the gas through the Atlantic Coast Pipeline will cost something between 66 and 110% more than the gas that you could buy not through the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but the ratepayers won't get that choice. So you'll be stuck paying for the cost of the infrastructure and the higher cost of the gas, because that's the gas they're going to deliver to you. So quick take then is that extension which says, hey, if you have the power of eminent domain and the landowners being grumpy and won't give it to you, won't negotiate freely, as though as a free negotiation when somebody says, look, well, if you don't like the price I give you, I'll just take it anyway. The court said, we'll just give it to you now and let you argue over price later. So quick take is this crazy extension of eminent domain. And so my read and our counsel's read is that these rights don't really exist in either the Natural Gas Act. They aren't part of what eminent domain was contemplated for, and they are extensions that the courts have granted. And they've largely granted them because of the political influence of these power companies, right? I mean, you all have seen it. Dominion more or less owns the state of Virginia. And I have had representative after representative after representative look me in the face and say those words. Say, we're just going to vote the way Dominion wants. You can't stop them. They more or less own the state. And it makes my head pop. My feeling always is, look, if you're not, man enough or woman enough to stand up to the companies and represent the people, then get out of office. You got the wrong job. That's what we put you there for. But that's just the facts. And I mean, I think we've seen it with our Democratic governor, and it's not a party issue. I mean, if this state makes it explicitly clear, it is not Republicans. And I will say one of the things that I think many of my friends who are maybe left of center or far left of center have done that hasn't always helped is tried to make it the Dems versus the Republicans, right? But in this state, it's explicitly clear that that doesn't solve the problem, right? We've had 2 Democratic governors in a row who've completely sold us out. And so my belief is that while the beauty of the landowner rights, citizen rights, due process, eminent domain position is it affords everyone the choice to say yes or no. And so, had Dominion started this project by saying we won't use eminent domain, we're going to freely negotiate our way to the coast, we're going to need to negotiate with landowners and pay royalties or buy their land or whatever, I probably wouldn't be in this fight today. And I regret that, because I think that I now know enough to know there are many other reasons to also not want this pipeline. But when you think about it, at its core, people at a minimum should say what does and doesn't happen on their land for whatever reasons. If it's because they love their trees, or they're worried about their water, or they don't like fracking, or they just don't want somebody building a pipeline on their property, the landowner rights perspective says all issues are equal. You have a right to choose. So, other questions, comments? Yes, Connie.
Can you speak to the whole business of tolling and quickly as part of the tolling would be the
Yeah, I mean, there's so much wrong with the way FERC runs the system. The toll, do people here know what tolling orders are? And probably, who's the most expert here? Tom, is that you on tolling orders? Probably. Would you describe that?
Well, basically, once a certificate is issued, you cannot appeal that decision until the FERC process is complete. The courts will say you don't yet have standing because you haven't used up all your administrative appeals. Okay? So you can't go from the certificate to the federal court saying, no, they didn't do the right process or consider the right information giving the certificate. But what FERC does is issue a series, what have come to be known as tolling orders, that postpone the review of the certificate. Because until that's complete, you can't take it to court. So for years, they've gone through and just delayed, and often they'll say, well, this process, step one will be complete in 90 days, and step two says, well, within 60 days of the issuance of the certificate, you have to move on to step two. So they put such a labyrinth of steps in there that are almost impossible to go through, that by the time you do, the pipeline's built, the court says, we're not going to consider it. What happened with the ACP is there was a decision to be made about whether another tolling order would be issued or whether the appeal process would be considered complete. And this is when the commission did not have all of its commissioners. And their Commissioner Glick, who was a recent Democratic appointee, decided not to vote, which would have created a tie in the vote, and continued the process. And by him abstaining, a vote was made, and that ended the FERC's decision on the appeal. It denied the appeal, the rehearing of the certificate. And that stopped the issuance of tolling orders. Am I explaining this in a way that makes sense to you? Once the certificate is issued, even though you've got all these other conditional permits on that, FERC and the pipeline company considers it, that's our approval to move forward.
Yeah.
Even though things like water quality, and these other federal permits that were issued in haste, we're finding out, it had holes in it. And now it's hung up in court, but they're still cut trees. They're still done doing
Yeah.
stuff like that. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah. So Connie, I would say that the tolling order is sort of detached. It really is a way for FERC to defer making a decision, which keeps you from being able to go to the courts. And so they basically hold up the citizenry until the pipeline gets far enough along so that the courts are like, well, it's kind of a moot point, so they don't take it up. And that's the way it's been used. It's just a delay, sort of unrelated to the issue of cutting the trees. Here's what I have recently heard explicitly from the Dominion folks. They intend to start cutting trees in Nelson County in September, and they want to start at Wintergreen and run that way. And the expectation is that they're negotiating hard with everybody they can to get easement deals done, and anyone they don't, they'll be filing quick take claims against again. So I can tell you in November, they filed quick take against our family, both properties. And many of you have heard me say they will not cut the first tree on our property without taking me away in cuffs first. And so I literally spent most of December thinking I would go to jail before Christmas. And I called my parents and said, I'm probably not going to be there over the holidays. And, this is just where we are. They then rescinded those because of the great work by the environmental lawyers who got the ruling on the appeals court to stop them from crossing the Appalachian Trail and the Blue Ridge Parkway here somewhat indefinitely, and also on the endangered species points as well. So we've done a great job beating them down on lots of these other things. And so they rescinded all of their quick take claims because it was going to be very difficult at a time when they knew they couldn't get through them and cut trees before the tree period was done. It was hard for them to argue that they needed immediate possession. But now that tree cutting will open up again in September, they're going to go hard again. And they're going to file quick take claims probably against everybody who they haven't settled with again this summer. And it's basically 3 weeks, and you have an expectation that you'll go to court within 3 to 4 weeks. It'll take a week or two for the court to decide, and there is no evidence yet that you'll get any court to deny quick take.
Just to follow up on the tolling order, did you say that they are not written in the law? This is just practice that's been adopted by the FERC?
Yeah,
Like the filibuster in the Senate?
yeah. Actually, the law requires FERC, if you petition for a rehearing, the law requires FERC to make a decision in, is it 60 days or 90 days? Something like that, 60 or 90 days. And so they have to say if they're going to allow a hearing or not, supposedly. What they've done instead is said, we're going to think about it. So they actually issue saying, we're going to, they're supposed to say, we're either going to consider a rehearing or we're not going to have a rehearing. Instead, what they do is they say, we're going to think about whether we're going to give you a rehearing. And it's sort of an indefinite thing. And they literally sit on those for years sometimes. In this case, as Tom said, a little bit by luck, the way things were playing out at the commissioner level, we got them to a place where they tripped up and had to. It was about a year. We had about a year worth of tolling order, and then they had to make a decision to deny rehearing. And when they did that, our cases could move forward in the courts, because we filed in federal court and in district court and in all the places we could through the Bold Alliance and others. But what happened is exactly what Tom said, is some of the courts said, well, this is premature to bring to the courts because you haven't exhausted the regulatory process and rights you have with FERC. And you're like, well, FERC won't hear it. But we sued in all the courts we could as a way of not letting them all pass. They basically try to pass the buck. Hey, this is an interesting claim, but it doesn't belong in this court, And so we sued in all of them, so that at the point at which all the courts had said it doesn't belong in this court, we said, well, wait a minute, it's got to belong in some court, right? And so we ended up in federal court now. Yes.
I have a question. I've heard organizations like Seldom say that they believe that the current oil and gas regulatory system, which historically developed out of a legal system which increasingly gives citizenship rights to corporations, is currently designed to regulate protest rather than to regulate safety, environmental concerns, and so forth. Do you think that's accurate?
Absolutely. And my experience with FERC is, I think, if you'd asked me before this started, first off, I wouldn't have known what FERC was, right? I mean, that's just a sad reality. I think one of the things that's most disappointing to me is that, I'm in my late 40s, and they built a lot of pipelines in my lifetime, and a lot of people have gone through exactly what I'm going through, and I'm so sorry I didn't know more and do more earlier, because it's wrong, right? But what you find is that I would have assumed that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was to weigh the pros and cons of a project in all aspects and do the right thing by the citizens. What you realize is they are quite explicitly organized to facilitate energy development. They've approved 53 LNG pipelines in the last 2 years, right? Which is slow actually for them. Out of all of the pipelines in their history, they have denied 2, right? Hundreds and hundreds of projects.
400
400?
in the last 20 years, and one of those 2 is still rattling around. They just say not yet, they don't say no.
Yeah. So what you realize is they have zero interest in what the public thinks. They are explicitly doing their job to make it possible to build more pipelines, period. So we need holistic reform. I've got an opportunity in a couple of weeks to go meet Chatterjee and Glick for the first time. I got about a little 30-minute meeting with them that was organized by the Niskanen Center, and we were talking about what do we want them to do. And I don't have huge hope, but my number one appeal to them will be this issue of the conditional permits plus the quick take. Plus the right to proceed. And in this case, what I'm going to be talking about is, right now, the only way, there are 3 ways that the ACP gets across the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Appalachian Trail in this spot. And that is, the Supreme Court takes up the case, which I don't think anybody believes they'll do, even Dominion, right? because it's not a constitutional issue, and it's not an issue where you have lower courts that are in conflict. So it's just not the kind of thing that the Supreme Court normally picks up. Secondly, the other way is they get Congress to give them explicit right. That's a risk, but not a high percentage. We got a lot of people working on that, and now with a democratically controlled Congress, we do have a number of folks who are worried about the environmental impacts that I think are going to work hard to make sure that isn't an end run around. And now lately, I think we've got a new concern, which is Trump might just by edict approve the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It's clearly illegal to do that, but that doesn't seem to stop him. So I think, but outside of those things, they can't build here. So I would say it is a very significant chance that the pipeline never crosses here. Now that doesn't mean they don't try to build from Buckingham South in a phased project. It doesn't mean they don't find a piece of private land along the Blue Ridge Parkway that they buy their way across, which they have the right to do. But any of those other things means they don't go through this part of Nelson County. And while those are still bad things we should resist, it would mean that they're never going to cut these trees, if that's true, on either side for a number of counties. And the idea that they would allow them at this moment in time, with that issue in such significant jeopardy, begin construction in these counties, just flies in the face of any good reason, right? It is an abuse of the citizens and the counties. It is inconsistent even with their stewardship, And so that's going to be the message that I, appeal to them. It's like the Hallorans case, right? How can you let them come do all of this damage that has a very significant chance of never needing to be done, Yeah.
Richard, I sort of disagree about Congress. There's been a lot of Democratic support for exporting natural gas to Europe to fight Russian influence in Europe. And a lot of Democrats have gotten behind that.
Yep.
So I think we still need to write our representatives and senators and say we're opposed to that sort of effort.
Oh, I could not agree more. I think the best thing we can do in Virginia is get all of our Virginia congressmen on our side, or as many as possible, because it's unlikely that the other congressmen are going to run over them if they're opposed to it. But it's still, it's not no risk by any means.
That was sort of my question too. It's like this end run in Congress that they're trying to pull. What are like the specifics around that? How are they trying to do it? What should the specific asks for our representatives in Congress be? Yeah,
there was a great meeting recently. The Allegheny Blue Ridge Alliance just held a big meeting with about 40 organizations talking very specifically about this. And so ABRA, if you're not on their mailing list, you should get on it. And them plus NRDC and others are all have campaigns specifically to go get to our congressmen. They've got letters, form letters and things you can write, but it's a full court press to get to our elected officials and get them to take a stand committing to not let them do it. They tried very hard, Dominion tried very hard to wedge this into the appropriations bill, to sort of reopen government this winter. And fortunately, we managed to keep it out of that, because the big risk, I think, is that, and again, there are people here who are more politically savvy than I am, but I think the big risk is it gets wedged into some other big must-pass legislation and very hard to pull out. If it gets attached as a rider to something, we're allowed to take it out. I mean, that's another pet peeve of mine. The idea that we've allowed our government to get to a place where you could be voting on something and have little attachments that have exactly nothing to do with the major issue is absurd, but that's a big thing to change. So, Hanuman?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. What you said about our constitutional rights, our supposed, and what you said about not realizing, this has been going on forever. Well, what we've learned in Buckingham is it's not just our rights of property,
No.
It's the inalienable rights to a livable environment. And we're talking about the rights of nature.
It's absolutely true.
This is the thing that CELDAP is really having some success with now, and it's becoming worldwide, where they're getting the rights of nature, the rights of rivers to exist. It's being added in constitution, so this is another constitutional issue that we have.
No, absolutely agree. And I mean, I think we have huge issues of discrimination, as we know. I mean, it is for sure, we should not just take it from a property rights issue. There are massive issues about this that are wrong. I mean, corruption to begin with. I mean, I have come to believe that I grew up the son of a Marine Corps colonel. It was a, strong, very right-wing household, and we grew up with this sort of belief that America was the greatest country in the world, and we were fighting against all the other banana republics. And I've come to believe that what I've seen in this country the last few years, and certainly in this state, makes me to believe we're no better than any of those banana republics. We're just trafficking in other things, and instead of calling them bribes, we call it campaign contributions. But it's the same damn thing, So I think one of the sad parts of this, Jill and I talk about this a lot, is that we grew up, relatively privileged white kids with the ability to not see a lot of the things that we now realize many other folks in our community have been seeing and raising and victims of for a long time, and we got a lot of work to do to make that right.
One interesting thing, the LNG pipelines and LNG facilities are certified under a different section of the Natural Gas Act. And Congress has said specifically you can't use eminent domain for those projects.
Really?
So, why? Why doesn't it apply to the other projects? Or
Yeah.
at least have to be clearly identified as a public benefit instead of just a private company wanting to make some money.
Yeah. Well, you all get to hear from Tom here in a bit, and he presented a case recently that is sort of mind-blowing. And what you realize is that, I would describe these pipelines as a massive, organized, explicit fraud upon the citizens of each of these states and our country. And that it has been done from the highest levels, from the very beginning. They said, look, we want to do this because we have created an ecosystem specifically for us to exploit. We have the gas, and we have certain rights to then seize land to transport that gas, and we have the right to charge the citizenry for whatever that project costs, so we don't have to really care and do it economically or smartly, and we can then charge them for the gas as well. Oh, and by the way, we've created an ecosystem that allows us to get a 14% return on our investment from that same citizenry. So run the price up, who cares? And the need isn't there. We know that, right? The independent studies say there's no need. We have a glut of gas. The demand is shrinking, and so when you look at all of the facts, you find yourself realizing it's a giant house of cards, right? And it only exists because not enough folks like us are aware and doing something about it. Because it's absolutely intolerable and unfair to everybody in this state. Every ratepayer, even the guys who are arguing with me on social media about we need jobs. We need jobs in a lot of places, but this is the worst possible way to create them, and it has an extraordinary tax on all of us. So.
Even before I became involved with pipelines or even knew anything about climate change, I recall there was a case in Connecticut that really rocked the public necessity requirement for eminent domain.
It was a Kelo case.
Kelo versus New London.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they really did broaden the consideration of public benefit, where it allowed cities, for example, to use eminent domain to seize property that was then sold to mall developers or housing developers and things like that. And that's what a lot of the energy companies, because you see, Dominion, the owners of the pipeline are not utilities. The pipeline itself is not a utility. It's considered a gas company by the Natural Gas Act. So they're not the same as Dominion building a distribution line or transmission line from the state. But Kelo really did open that up, and a lot of people are trying now to push back against that, but it's a difficult.
Well, the interesting thing about Kelo was it was the conservative justices that wanted to prevent the eminent domain, and it was the liberal justices that voted in favor of it. So there may be, if there's more of a conservative bent in the Supreme Court, that some of the quick take rules that the private property may trump some.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I mean, I've been shocked that we haven't had more conservative voices in the pipeline fight, specifically because of that. You know, there's only one that I know of. Well, there's a handful, but the biggest mouth that we've got on that is Denver Riggleman, you know, who's a local guy here, and he got involved because the original path of the pipeline was going to go right through his distillery and his farm there as well. You know, but we've had very little engagement from the conservative folks on this issue, and I think it's largely because the Dominion has been effective in creating this is a energy independence fight against tree hugging eco nuts. You know, I mean, that's kind of been their whole thing all along, and you know, and they've managed to sell that so that we really split the communities, I think.